Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. It's good to be back after that short hiatus, and I wouldn't have thought of a better guest to have on coming back. Tonight, I have Professor Danny Shaw with me, and tonight we are going to talk about a recent article he wrote called Vladimir the Terrible. We're going to link the article in the description. Professor Shaw, in this article, you lay out why Russia is in the crosshairs of US imperialism and how Putin became public enemy number one after rescuing Russia from the humiliation and destruction of the US-backed Yeltsin era. Let's start debunking some of the propaganda that average Americans are indoctrinated with by our State Department and corporate media. You start off the article by pointing out how the military-industrial complex needs enemies like a body needs oxygen, and how Pentagon spin doctors create boogeyman to justify the $778 billion budget. So who were some of these boogeymen, and why were they backed by the CIA to begin with?
Yes, good evening to Red Lettuce, anti-imperialist greetings to all the friends and comrades out there. I think the timing is important right now to seek ideological clarity on Russia. Why these Russiaphobic campaigns? What is it about Putin and Russian state leadership that mostly the Democrats, there's actually a certain ideological affinity with Fox News and some of the socially conservative stances that Putin and others have taken. Hopefully we can get into that, but certainly it's been the liberals who've meted out the most aggression through MSNBC and CNN. And that's one of the contradictions, right, of this this oligarchy, they call it, they insist upon calling it a democracy. One would have to be quite naive to think there's anything democratic about this system, but this oligarchy, it's been the liberals, it's been the Hillary Clintons and the Joe Bidens who've always been warmongering when it comes to Russia, and Ukraine is their latest excuse. So I'll read the title to the full article. I can't remember the full title myself. I don't know if you have it there in front of you, but quote unquote Vladimir the Terrible fits the needs of the U.S. military-industrial complex for a evil foreign enemy, quote unquote. But the real Putin is well regarded by many Russians for standing up to U.S. imperialism and reviving the Russian economy. So I first started writing this piece actually in 2014, because in 2014, there was this debate in the left about Russia's role in Syria. And without having illusions about Putin and the Russian leadership, it was also objectively clear that if it wasn't for the Russians, they were going to Libyaize, they were going to recolonize, they were going to take Damascus. And it was only the incredible determination of the Syrian Arab army, Bashar al-Assad, the everyday Syrian people, that was able to defeat ISIS. In the US, has always kept ISIS on a short leash. ISIS was convenient in Syria with a quote unquote common enemy. ISIS wasn't convenient crossing this porous border into Iraq. These are the Sykes-Picot borders. These are French colonial, British colonial borders to draw up the Middle East. ISIS wasn't convenient, obviously, in US-controlled, US-occupied Iraq. So Russia played a fundamental role. Russia only has one naval base outside of its own territory, and that is in Syria, not too far from Russia's actual borders. And that's something that we have to peel back layers and layers of, because right now the propaganda is so strong that Russia's the aggressor, as if NATO and the US were just so innocent. So we'll get into that. But in terms of your question, how many acting presidents like Manuel Noriega were nothing more than CIA assets, trained by the School of the Americas, the dictators that they propped up in Guatemala during the dirty wars in the 1980s, when hundreds of thousands of Central Americans lost their lives. So you have the Somosas and the Trujillos. The famous quote from the Secretary of State at the time with Somoza was, yes, he's a son of a, I won't say the B word, but a son of a gun, but he is our son of a B word. So they understood that these dictators were hated, but if they did the bidding like a Duvalier in Haiti, and if they could prosecute this Cold War agenda, if they were allies of capitalism and the global class struggle, whether in Nicaragua or Haiti or the Horn of Africa, anywhere in the world, then they were going to get behind these quote unquote strong men. So these are some of the CIA assets. Of course, Saddam Hussein had the infamous meetings with the State Department and Donald Rumsfeld. Osama bin Laden, where did he cut his teeth in the anti-Soviet adventure in Afghanistan? So I think there's so many layers to peel back that expose that what's happening now in Ukraine and Russia, this is what the Pentagon needs. Just today, the House of Representatives, 300 to like 70 passed Biden's proposal, $368 billion, $768 billion Pentagon budget, which is actually more than Trump asked for. And Biden's critique was, no, we need more training, more soldiers, more money. Now it's his critique of the police. Everyone across the nation is marching, defund the police. And Biden says, no, we, talk about tone deaf. Biden says, no, we need to give the police more resources. That's the problem. So just to understand that in many senses, it's the Democrats that are the sheep or the fox compared to the Republicans that are the wolf, but who's more dangerous? And at the end of the day, who gets more done for the police state, for the military industrial complex, and the invention of artificial enemies? The Russian people is not our enemy. Putin's not responsible for the murders in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He's not responsible for Ahmaud Arbery and that racist execution in Georgia. But they've trained us so thoroughly to be anti-Russian. Of course, there's the history of anti-Sovietism, to be anti-Putin. And what's the real reason they hate Putin? Because they can't control him. He won't be the Boris Yeltsin, the puppet that Yeltsin was.
Right, and I think we're going to get more to who Putin really is, and what he's done for Russia, and what interests is he serving there in Russia. And I think we are programmed to think that all of our enemies are overseas, these made up enemies, but in reality, our enemies are right here at home. The people who control the military industrial complex, the big pharma, we have the insurance, the health insurance lobby. We have the people that are poisoning our water supply, the people on Wall Street. Those are the people who are destroying America, and those are the people who, and the oil bankers as well. Like, those are the people who are make profits from invading and keeping the global South underdeveloped to make sure that their profits keep going up. So those are the people. Our enemies are here at home in the United States. They're not overseas. They're not any of these people like Putin or the president of China. They're all right here in America. like the people we just mentioned. You touched on a little bit ago on this, but US corporate media and the State Department seem to have an obsession with using Ukraine as an example to ramp up tensions, demonize and sanction Russia, even though Russia has never posed a threat to any country. So why is Russia in the crosshairs of US imperialism to begin with? And when did Ukraine become their scapegoat?
Yes, great questions there. Ukraine is their Taiwan or their Tibet or their Hong Kong, if you will. They need justifications to continue to move more NATO troops and US troops east. In 1991, when Mikhail Gorbachev oversees the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, he becomes the Times Man of the Year and gets a Nobel Peace Prize, because this was the end of the multipolar world, the end of the Warsaw Pact, the end of the socialist camp. I mean, Cuba remained, but super isolated. That's when the blockade truly hit Cuba. And James Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, James Baker pledged, we will not move NATO, 1 inch further towards Russia, further east, which was, of course, the lie of the century. Any anti-imperialist with any training could see through that one at the time. And what they sought to do was, of course, balkanize the Soviet Union, break down all of the social and economic gains, everything enshrined within the Soviet Constitution. For whatever critiques we could have, the Soviet Union stood as an impenetrable social formation which prioritized its people's health and socioeconomic rights over profits. And 1991 is the beginning of an epic of a decade of complete humiliation. Boris Yeltsin, infamous drinker, bootlicker of the West, opens up this massive prize on the global chessboard and says, the highest bidders can have it. The gas reserves, the oil reserves, the nickel. I mean, Russia is arguably, it's the most massive country in the world. It's where the greatest concentration of wealth in the world. Africa, South America, Russia, the Middle East. Those are the areas with the greatest preponderance of natural resources. So the vultures zoomed in and sank their teeth in. There was something called the voucher system. They tried to play it off as forking over all of these formerly nationalized industries as if it was a democratic process, but the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, the international oligarchs were waiting in the wind, salivating over this opportunity. And Boris Yeltsin was their yes man. So a high percentage, according to all the polls, saw Vladimir Putin, someone that came up through the Russian intelligence networks, the KGB, somebody who had the socialist Marxist training, though he's no Marxist. That's important to clarify from the jump. Mm-hmm. Russia is a small capitalist power compared to the United States. Internationally, it's a medium-sized power, but compared to the US, it's really small militarily in terms of its GDP. All the numbers are there in the article. So when Putin comes in, immediately the West, through its neoliberal mouthpieces, MSNBC and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, they're immediately alarmed. But they can't openly say we're alarmed the Russian people are coming to take back their resources, or some of the Russian oligarchs are now more nationalist oligarchs. No, they had to say Putin doesn't respect human rights, and Putin is this and that. And those things are true too. Putin is no friend of the gay community. Putin is, we don't have to have illusions about any of this. Putin has framed himself. He had a speech about 2 months ago in Sochi. He frames himself as the anti-progressive. And he was laughing at all of the identity politics and the different movements here around identity. And that goes back to what I was mentioning. There's an ideological bond or marriage between the Putins and the Navalny's and these conservative Russian values. These are the same values as Fox and what's to the right of Fox, Breitbart, and so there's this weird kinship from these different entities. So from the jump, no one on the left here should be an apologist for Putin and the Russian oligarchs. That's not where we're coming from. But Putin's main mistake, who had nothing to do with this and had everything to do that he was a type of nationalist representative of the oligarchs. Whereas Navalny's more quote unquote globalized. Just so you can understand the whole thing about Navalny's the great Democrat and he should be the, that's
and he has some backward, he has a much more backward view on like social issues, doesn't he? He's not a friend of like the gay community either or anything else like that. He's like a really rabid racist, isn't he?
Yeah, they both come from the Russian oligarchy, but they do have they represent different factions, but neither of them represent. Now, if anyone has any doubts about any of what I'm saying, just watch RT for a few hours and you can see a whole bunch of immigrant bashing and xenophobic stuff, which is another deep conversation, not to get ahead of ourselves, but it's an interesting bullet point for every organization on the left, every anti-imperialist organization. How do you define your relationship to Russian state media? RT is the umbrella. Underneath RT is Sputnik and Redfish News and all these different entities, which are in different places on the ideological spectrum. I think Redfish News, they're like straight socialist, anti-imperialist. They're dope as can be. But for example, I was on RT, must have been a year ago, and who am I on with? Rudolph Giuliani. So, I mean, you never know. Yeah. One minute they have, their whole ideology is to create whatever disruption in the West. So they come from the far right, or they come from what some people would call far left. I'm not going to use that verbiage. I would say the anti-imperialist left or the socialist left. But that's why they'll have, just so people understand the thinking of the RT hierarchy. I mean, why would they have those of us from the socialist movement have 10-year relationships with RT? And that's an interesting point to debate. If the Russian state has all these contradictions, should one still use their platform? RT America, RT International, RT en Español. Should you use those platforms? And that's for each organization, each cadre, each independent journalist to arrive at their own conclusion. Capitalism is very sophisticated. If they can't bomb, not just actual bombs, but ideologically bomb a country with Trump's slogan, whatever Trump's slogans were, then there's that famous meme where the Biden bombs and the Obama bombs have little tickets that say Black Lives Matter and
right.
Gay Pride. They're going to bomb that way. Some people who are a little older will remember the Pussy Riots and the punk groups in St. Petersburg and across Russia. But Russia is a very conservative society overall.
Right.
It's a traditional society. There's the Orthodox Church. So when they went into actual Christian churches and desecrated certain things, that was not something that like the Russian people were very fond of. But here, through the liberal media outlets, they can demonize Russia and Putin in this way. So it's very, very sophisticated what they do.
Yeah, it's all just Now it's all about being like a woke imperialism.
Exactly.
That's the age of imperialism that we're in right now. Explain what is behind the new Russiaphobia that everyday Americans are indoctrinated with. Why are they led to believe a country with a productive capacity that's 20 times less than the US is a threat to them?
Yeah, yeah. What US imperialism and the unipolar hegemonic project is afraid of, they're afraid of any economic, diplomatic, or military rivalry, that anyone can stand up. You know, supposedly it was the end of history in 1991. Capitalism has won. We were going to live in this new globalized society. All the hypocrisy of neoliberalism when they talk about free trade. I mean, all they mean is that free trade for them. Whenever free trade where they reign, as soon as the Chinese can compete or anyone else can compete, suddenly all the tariffs and sanctions, and it has nothing to do with free trade, clearly. Though their definition of free trade is nothing more than free foxes left to roam freely among free chickens and turkeys. Who's going to win out? Of course, the foxes. So what are they afraid of in Russia? The Russia of Putin in the Chavez years. I was just with the Venezuelan youth leadership. We had a conference, and shout out to the Bolivarian Revolution, everything they've taught us, holding fast in the crosshairs of imperialism. In the Chavez years, the Russians sent 150,000 Kalashnikovs to the Bolivarian militias that had formed organically across Venezuela to defeat a pending US attack, which is still pending and which has come in all types of hybrid forms. Russia diplomatically has vetoed different US through the UN Security Council war efforts. Russia did nothing for Libya, but I mentioned Syria. If it wasn't for the Russians and the fierce resistance in the east of Ukraine in the Donbas region, what would have happened in the east of Ukraine today? What would have happened in Crimea? That was, there's been some 13,000 Ukrainians and Russians who've lost their lives in this new iteration of the Cold War. So the powers that be hate Russia and their maximum leadership for all of these reasons, because a strong, dignified, sovereign Russia means that it's much more difficult to penetrate Russia itself. And we can no longer talk about the same unipolar world of 20 years ago or 30 years ago. You have the Bolivarian camp with fresh victories in Honduras, fresh victories in Peru. Those victories are under attack, but it's a new relationship. International relations is studying one country's position internationally vis-a-vis another country's. A strong Russia, a strong China, I mean, that's their greatest fear. And that's what never happened when it should have happened in the 1960s and 70s. The Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution were very well positioned to unite militarily, economically, diplomatically. Then there's Kissinger and Richard Nixon's secret visit to King in 1971. And US imperialism is quick. They're going to play off whoever they can against whoever they can. Right now, they're working in overdrive with the right wing in Peru, trying to lead these impeachment proceedings against Pedro Castillo. They're trying to figure out Xiomara Castro. Is she going to be conciliatory? Is she going to be Fidel Castro strong? No, she ain't going to be that strong. Can we work with her? Is she going to go after our largest base in South America, in Honduras, the Soto airfields? So US intelligence is constantly monitoring Russia. And when they couldn't penetrate the way they wanted to, that's when they said, this is not our man in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And that's what's fueled the Russophobia. I mean, it was so ridiculous in 2016. I mean, anyone who has liberal family, you went from the living room to the dining room, and it's MSNBC in one room and CNN,
Right.
and Rachel Maddow, and it was nauseating. The anti-Russia stuff, and I mean, what Trump was basically saying was, and of course he had his own egotistical agenda. Trump is no friend of any working person, but he was basically saying, why bomb St. Petersburg or Pyongyang when we can build Trump towers and Trump hotels? So he just wanted to recolonize, quote unquote, through peace. Of course, that wouldn't represent peace for the Russian people. But I think it's important to peel back the layers of how the different ideological mouthpieces of US capitalism see Russia and why they feel threatened by Russia. And then to clarify, what is Russia? Certainly not socialist. The Russian Communist Party, the Russian left, has all types of critiques of Putin and the Russian state. 2014 radicalized a new generation of Russians because the Russians could see clearly that Ukraine, in the quote unquote Maidan Revolution, which was nothing more than a counter revolution, with the most conservative ideologues from the US. Newland was the diplomat, and she got caught talking about how horrible the EU was on tape, and John McCain went over there for the selfies. And this whole new generation of Russians and Ukrainians could see that a strong Russia, a nationalist Russia, a Putin's Russia, if you will, was objectively in conflict with the encroaching NATO-US war machine. And a lot of those Russians who became more nationalistic also became more internationalist and more socialist, and found their way to Marxism, Leninism, and socialism because of what. So that's the dialectic, right, of US aggression. Of course, the oligarchs of Ukraine are celebrating, and some Russian oligarchs are celebrating, the Navalny's, etc., because they have a vested interest in this conflict. So Ukraine became the justification to further hate Russia. And just to end with an ideological clarification, what is Russia today? Russia is a type of system that draws from the Orthodox Russian Church, that traditional value system that I referenced.
Right.
Capitalist, certainly. Some social benefits increasingly on the chopping block, whether it's pensions or workers' ability to unionize. There's some Soviet nostalgia, some Stalin nostalgia, Lenin nostalgia, not that much. And again, this is coming also through different Russian youth leaders, and we thought about having some of the youth leaders come on, but there's the language barriers and the time barriers in Russia. But in the future, of course, it's better to hear it from the Russian leaders themselves. But they've educated me, and I could ask away. And what they also talked about was that there's this white nostalgia. Now, when I say white nostalgia, and anti-identity politics is huge. Again, just watch RT if you have any doubts. So it's this hodgepodge. It's this halfway house between all these different ideological influences. It's definitely not where any leftist is coming from. But the white nostalgia, when I say white nostalgia, we're talking about the Tsar and Tsarism, and the 14 encroaching imperialist armies who invaded Russia in 1918. This wasn't a civil war any more than it was never a Syrian civil war. It was a Syrian civil war internationalized by the US and their proxy powers, mainly Saudi Arabia and in Turkey. So 14 imperialist countries invaded Russia in 1918, to quote Winston Churchill, to drown the Bolshevik baby in the bathwater. So that's the Russian social formation with all of those contradictions. But why does it come into objective contradiction with imperialism? For the reasons that I laid out, because any degree of nationalism is what the U.S. can never tolerate. Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, Dilma Rousseff and Lula, these weren't great revolutionaries. Rafael Correa was to the left of them, but these aren't Marxist, Leninist, Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh trained. These are like liberal leftists, but the fact that they're anti-imperialists and they question a U.S. base. Oh.
Right. They want someone who's going to stick to the U.S. Hegemony, to sell their country to the highest bidder. That's what they want. They want a yes man type deal, that's someone they can rely on. And it just goes to show you, like, some of the people who the U.S. State Department and the media used to celebrate, they quickly turn on at the drop of a hat, because when they no longer serve their interests, or if they step out of bounds or start doing some start going against the interest of Wall Street or the oil companies, they are quickly demonized and overthrown, and a new puppet is put in, or it's the country's completely just destroyed. And then it has all these terrorist groups that the CIA funds, and it creates chaos. So yeah, I think even if you do try to serve U.S. imperialism, they will you can't always trust them. They will definitely turn on you when you no longer serve their interest.
100%.
Talk about the players in the Russian economy. Who are these central players that run it, and what is Putin's main objective, and which class interest does he serve?
Yeah, I touched upon some of this with earlier responses. There's a general consensus with these oligarchs, with these central players in the economy. You can read about them in Forbes magazine, the Russian billionaires, the magnates. And there's a consensus that Putin is their man. Putin is who stabilizes their operations, the drainage of wealth from the everyday Russian workers and people. They clearly have no interest in returning to the Soviet days. Another group has attached their destiny, their interest to the Navalny's, which would represent a more penetrated, quote unquote, globalized Russia. So they have a class interest or a personal interest in dethroning Putin, getting rid of Putin. And the article goes deeper into some of the families. I think another point that I want to just make right now, the underreporting in the media. We keep hearing about the Russian buildup, 100,000, 125,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. I mean, how many US troops on the Canadian border? How many US troops occupying Hawaii, which is nothing but a neo-colony? How many US troops on the Mexican border? So every day, NATO and the US carries out drills, sends more troops to the Black Sea. That would be the equivalent of Russia and China doing war drills in the Gulf of Mexico,
right,
or in between Hawaii and California, which is a 3-4 hour flight. I mean, it's not like Hawaii's right there. So again, the brazen hypocrisy that somehow Russia is the aggressor. Russia has the right to protect its own national security, its own national borders. So the underreporting, the one-sided reporting is very dangerous. That's what injects this horrific virus of Russiaphobia. that really, I think, plagues huge swaths of our class against this country, is obsessed with. And now they just announced they're not going to they're not going to honor the Beijing Olympics because, I mean, it's just the sensationalism. It's not true reporting. There's another great meme with a U.S. tank, and plastered over the U.S. tank is the logos of CNN and Fox and MSNBC. And these are corporate pro-war hawk networks. And like Eduardo Galeano said, it's how I opened the article, they need enemies like the human lungs need oxygen. And where real enemies don't exist, they have to create these xenophobic campaigns. They have to put bounties on Nicolas Maduro and Diosdado Cabello, the Venezuelan people's leadership. They have to label Cuba, tiny Cuba, a terrorist. So those are the labels to try to convince the American people of that they try to create these artificial enemies. That's what's behind everything right now. And it's going to further polarize things. More Russians are going to become more nationalistic, more anti-NATO, anti-US, if they're not already, because these are severe violations of their airspace, their waters, an incredible insult to their dignity. And that's why a lot of Russians, not just Russians, but all the different former Soviet socialist republics, that's why they remember from Tajikistan to Uzbekistan to Georgia to Ukraine, especially the older generations who experienced the Soviet Union. They remember that their housing rights and their healthcare rights their rights to vacation were enshrined in the Constitution. And all of that was torn up in 1991.
I guess maybe we should probably touch on like who exactly is Putin? Like what are some of the, I'm sure we could talk like all night about Putin, but like maybe we should just highlight some of his like greatest achievements for Russia and the global community in general. And also, what are his shortcomings? What are some of Putin's shortcomings? I know we mentioned like his social conservatism, but is there anything more than that?
Certainly, I think that's the essence of it. You know, we come from progressive, anti-imperialist value system, anti-racism, defend no human being is illegal. I mean, RT, which is on some level, I don't want to say a mouthpiece of the Kremlin because then I sound like Time Magazine or the New York Times, but RT does a lot of stuff that's very, very anti-immigrant. RT carried this whole line, and our RT it represents that Putin, quote unquote, value system, if you will. Like RT would always say, it's the Biden migrant crisis. So what does that mean? No, it's a crisis of neocolonialism. It's a crisis of how many decades and centuries of humiliation in Central America, in the Caribbean, and the Haitian people want to be free and self-determining, and the Honduran people and the Salvadorian people. I could tell you a lot of kind of inside stories, but I want to keep some of the stuff somewhat private. But I think there's a lot of ideological diversity under the RT umbrella as well that I've pointed at, but it's certainly been hurtful to see them carry stories in favor of the far right in France, the far right in Hungary. They're very favorable. So that's actually the ideological kinship that they keep. Putin's greatest mistakes, Putin's greatest gains. Yeah, certainly when Putin rose to power, it was more of a nationalist sentiment. If they're going to have their media, we can have our media. We have a right to our resources. And did it help everyday Russian people? Not like the history of the Soviet Union. And everyone needs to study the Soviet Union and study it dialectically, because our approach as dialectical materialists It's not that Putin is good, Putin is bad. No, that's not the conversation. There's two types of people you can't trust in the world. Those that say that everything Stalin did, Stalin was amazing, Stalin was perfect. Can't trust those people. Right. And then there's the other people, oh, Stalin was horrible and Stalin killed. And they never mention the defeat of the Nazi war machine. 27 million Soviets gave their lives. So you can't trust people. So you got to have Trotsky here. You got Stalin here. You got Lenin everywhere. You got to study all that stuff. And so many people out here, I'm not going to go into a deep thing on the Soviet Union, Soviet leadership, but I think we need more ideological clarity because people want to fall into this box. Stalin wasn't a Stalinist. Trotsky wasn't a Trotskyist. Right. They were both Marxist-Leninists to their dying day. Right. So I think that's something, and they weren't flawless Marxist-Leninists, but they both made incredible contributions that we need to study. So I didn't quite answer your question, ABC, but I wanted to put out those bullet points too.
Yeah, no, I think this kind of goes into my next question, actually. So how did Russia go from being a socialist superpower where the Russian people were accustomed to egalitarian socioeconomic rights that the people of the United States continue to struggle to achieve today, to a vassal state of the US? Compare the conditions under the Soviet system versus the capitalist system they have now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, 1991, we should study deeper the implosion, how the Soviet Union fell, attempts by different leaders of the Soviet Communist Party and of the Russian military to not let it fall. When that fell, it wasn't just the Soviet Union, it was the Warsaw Pact, it was the socialist aligned countries, East Germany. The wall fell, that was the anti-fascist wall. In the West, we've only heard negative things about that wall, but you have to contextualize what happened. And the Soviet troops, the Red Army, the partisans marching all the way to Berlin. I mean, all of humanity owes the most incredible debt to the Red Army in the different Soviet peoples. Again, 27 million, when you put that number 27 million up against how many US soldiers died and how many British soldiers died, and there were British civilians as well, but the numbers are not even close. I mean, the casualties on the US side, I want to say 200,000 range, on the English side, 400,000 range, on the German side, 800,000 range, maybe closer to 1 million. I mean, how do you even conceive of what the Soviet Union was able to do? First, they went through the Civil War and internationalized proxy war against the Bolsheviks, against their leadership from 1918 to 1920. Horrific, horrific. A lot of the Bolsheviks, that's when a lot of the Bolsheviks, the old guard, were killed. They gave their lives for their homeland and for the socialist project. And then really a generation later, to this day, the Russian people still suffer the impact. When you lose 27 million people, I mean, here in the US would be the equivalent of something like twice or 3 times that because of our population. I mean, it's impossible demographically for us to even conceive of it. So they achieved, Lenin's slogan was socialism plus electricity. Soviets plus electricity equals socialism. They achieved being a backwards czarist autocracy with how many millions living in utter darkness and illiteracy to becoming the rival of the capitalist imperialist US and all of their underlings and junior partners. What the Soviet Union did is it's impossible to even wrap our heads around. And all of the social benefits for a worker, 2 months paid vacation for every worker. When you got married, part of the honeymoon is paid vacation, just stuff that in the West we couldn't even conceive of. And that's why there's this ideological attack on the Soviet Union. So people should be well read in the Soviet Union. Now, I'll direct your attention to this flag, the flag of Zimbabwe and the flag of Mozambique There you see in the center, my light is blocking it, but there you see in the center of this flag from, I'm confusing now myself, shame on me if it's Zimbabwe or Mozambique. I want to say Mozambique. She's my own living room. Uh, I spent time in both countries and they both had revolutionary movements. So, but that flag has the Kalashnikov inside the Communist Manifesto with the star of internationalism. The Kalashnikov, where did it come from? It came from the Soviet Union. So where did the Soviet Union line up? There was never a Cold War. The Cold War is a euphemism. It was a hot war. It was a global class war. And where did the global class war play out? The global class war played out in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. Who supported the ANC? You know, when Mandela died, all these hypocrites in Washington and CNN, oh, Nelson Mandela, they vilified Nelson Mandela. They helped put him in prison. US Congress sent money to apartheid South Africa. Who was supporting the freedom fighters? These Germans, the Soviet Union, Libya. I mean, so you have to see the global class conflict. Now the global class conflict, the new Cold War, the new aggression against Russia, the new aggression against China. If these countries like Peru or Ecuador or Brazil, if they want to pivot towards China, pivot towards Russia, they don't have to depend. Remember, colonialism was dependency on the enemy. So Russia, Soviet Union and Russia today, objectively, have created this pluripolar world. That's what Hugo Chavez talked about. We want a world with many poles and many options and many systems. That's what the Zapatistas talk about. That's what every revolutionary talks about. So that's why they're dead set on demonizing the Russia of today. It's by no means the Soviet Union of how many decades, 7, 8 decades, but there are some parallels that we can touch, that we just touched upon.
Right, and it's just really, I think it's really important to understand that, like, once the Soviet system was dismantled, the you know, how the Russian people's lives were totally changed for the worst. You know, life expectancy completely dropped. The birth rate dropped. You know, the population itself. You know, I'm sure. What was it? They lost what, 10% of their population after that.
100%.
You know, this like shock doctrine of neoliberal capitalism.
That's what it was. Open up Russia, this gigantic prize of the global chessboard. Bring in the IMF, bring in the World Bank, bring in all the experts, which is a euphemism, it's a camouflage for Dracula, for the vultures, for the sharks. And that's why Putin represents these new generations. No, we're not going to be a vassal state.
Right. And it's just like a 9-day difference. You know, under the Soviet system, you know, life expectancy was going up, birth rate was going up, literacy rates, people, you know, full employment, you know, all these, like we were saying, all these socioeconomic gains that are, you know, the American worker can only just dream of, you know, the Soviet Union had for their people there. And just goes to show you the class character of your state matters a lot. And that's why we have what we have here in the United States. We don't have a government that represents the workers. We have a government that represents the imperialists, the people who, you know, want to keep alive a system that makes profits through destruction. And that doesn't benefit the majority of people, the majority of workers, not just here, but across the globe. And that's why it's important to study these societies and systems that did exist and currently exist, like in China, Cuba, Venezuela, you know, the DPRK, we can learn from them, and we could see we could have those same conditions as well for ourselves. So it's really important. And then once people start to see that, they'll really see who the real enemies are. It's not, anyone overseas. It's they're all right here in America, and we've named them all pretty much throughout this segment. So Danny, I really appreciate you coming on our show, or on the Red Lettuce again, and hopefully we'll have you on soon. Before we wrap up, please let people know where they could find your work.
Oh, for sure. I'm on Twitter and IG at Danny Shaw CUNY. CUNY is the City University of New York. I recently wrote a book review of this book, Is Russia Fascist? It's a book worth reading. I learned certainly a great deal. I would say that the author doesn't come from the same ideological place that we come from here with the Red Lettuce family, but still worth reading with a critical eye. Then I just reached into my Soviet section. We should do a library tour. I'm very proud of all my books on the Soviet Union, but this book is truly fascinating. Russia at War, a simple title. It's Alexander Worth was an American journalist, but he was born and raised in Leningrad in St. Petersburg. And he just goes through the everyday heroism of the Russian people and how they defeated the Nazi war machine. I mean, this book is gold. So that's the main thing. Just be super well read. We all, as revolutionaries, the Panthers woke up. The CPUSA in the 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, wake up and just hit them books, read The Enemy, and what they're saying on Russia and the Ukraine. But then, as revolutionaries, how do we hold up what the enemy is saying and then refract it back to the working class so they don't fall for these headlines?
Right.
So how do we build up the counter arguments as intellectuals of our class in defense of those class interests? So thanks to Redfish for everything, Redfish. Thanks to Red Lettuce and Redfish.
Yeah.
For all the work that
they're the food. It's a same, food group, so it's all good. We're covering them. Covering the food groups here.
There you go. There you go.
All right, Danny. Thank you so much. We look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you.